So let me maybe just say a few words about myself, explaining why, oh my God, PowerPoint doesn't work very well for me here. But in any case, my own personal background, I started as a technologist and I worked for 10 years as a computer person, team leader, etc. And then at one point I decided that I want to do kind of a switch into the business world and went and did an MBA at INSEAD in Fontainebleau in France. And since then, except for a few years which I spent in the sales environment, I worked on the, let's say, the border of financing and high tech, in venture capital, in venture debt, in investment banking. So in the past 10 years or so, I've seen, I think, hundreds of business plans and the company dozens of startups, which really, I believe, brings me to the point where I have a lot of business practices, best practices in this area of moving from an idea to something more commercial. So let's just start by talking about the process, and this will give sort of a context to the entire lecture. We all start with an idea. It could be a university professor, it could be an entrepreneur, with his feverish mind. And then the question is how to move on from here. And you need to do some research in order to see what can be done with this idea. For example, you come up with an idea for anti-fraud software because you know that banks have a lot of fraudulent activity that they need to deal with. So now you need to do some research and turn this idea into a technology. For example, an algorithm that could help you, work with data and analyze it and get some information from it to try and see what is fraudulent and what isn't. And then when you have a technology, you need to do some feasibility studies. Sometimes it's technology in life sciences or something in electronics, and you really need to understand if it's feasible. And here comes the point of trying to understand if it's something that has any usage. Because, we all know that in the past we have seen some technologies that started just as a technology. The laser is a good example of that, with no real usage. And then later on, people discovered usages, commercial usages, and started to understand how to make money from that. But clearly at the beginning, it's good if you start also thinking about the market and not just focusing on the technology. At that point, you turn it into an application. In the case of the anti-fraud solution, maybe a little piece of software that you believe could sit, between the transaction of the bank and the bank system and see what might be fraudulent and what isn't. And then we move on into initial development. We build a prototype, and we productize it to make a solution. And actually, I'm going to focus on one way which is pretty common of taking an idea and commercializing it, and this is the idea of building a company, as we've seen in the previous lecture. There are other ways of doing that. You could develop your IP and maybe sell it to someone. You could, maybe cooperate with other people, an existing company, etc. But I think that the common way of doing that is really by starting your own company. Now, as was said earlier on, not everyone is capable of that. Not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone who works in a research organization or in an academic organization necessarily wants to build their own company, be an entrepreneur. But in many cases, either through luck or through cooperation, you can find the real ingredients and turn them into that company. So let me just throw in the air some best practices and some questions that come up. If I have a neat idea, what do I do to commercialize it? So one of the big questions is there a burning need for what I'm doing? For example, this fraud piece of software, I know by talking to people in banks that yes, they have a problem and they're losing money because of fraud, so there is a need for that. So when I have a neat idea, what I should do maybe is talk to potential customers and ask them, do you really need this? This is true in the case of what we call B2B, software that you sell from your company to another company like a bank. But what do you do in the B2C cases when you have a neat idea? When you develop a new phone, like the iPhone, who do you ask? You can't just stop people on the street. You can do focus groups, but in many cases, in these particular situations of consumer products or consumer software, consumer hardware, you just need to launch it and, hope for the best. And this is why such projects would maybe receive a little bit of less funding at the beginning, just to see, how they, like a neat website. Okay, you publish the website, you use a little bit of money, you see if you get traffic, and if you do, then maybe you go for a little bit more money, etc. So the question of the need really depends on what you're working on. Does your idea have to be original? Does it have to be defensible? Do you have to have intellectual property rights and register them as a patent? And again, it really, really depends. There are two paradigms. One of them is called the Brave New World. You come up with something that has never been there before, like the smartphone. People used to work with feature phones, and then at one point, the smartphone came up, and it wasn't there before, and now we all use it. But another idea, another option is not the Brave New World, but what one calls the better mousetrap, something that already exists, but you want to improve it. And Google is a good example of that. The Google search engine, when it came into existence, there were search engines on that, at these days, Alta Vista and others, and we all remember them. Google came with a better mousetrap. The same thing, search engines, but with a twist of, the page ranking, you probably know the story, and then they sort of took this area by storm, and now they're far ahead of anyone else. So again, it really depends. You don't have necessarily to be original. Sometimes you can do something that people did before you, but if you come with the right twist, then it's okay. Do you need to write the IP to submit a patent proposal? Not necessarily. In many cases of the software industry, you don't have to have a patent. In life sciences, on the other hand, in most cases, a patent is crucial. So again, it depends. If I have a neat idea, do I have to have a team? What comes first? Do I need to assemble a team of 3 people, one of them more academic, another one more business-like, a third one in marketing, and then find an idea? Or maybe I need to be a single person with an idea and then find a few people to work with me. Both things can happen, and if you look at the history of ideas turning into companies and making money, then you see all options. One thing that I do want to emphasize in this case is something that investment people always say: it's better to have an A team with a B idea than a B team with an A idea. And the reason is that things change on the way. You start with your idea, and then the market changes all of a sudden. And if it's an A team, they would know to adapt. But if it's a B team, suddenly their A idea was not as good as it was supposed to be, and they wouldn't know what to do. So it's a chicken and egg thing. Not necessarily an idea before a team or a team before an idea, but the team, interestingly enough, is more important than the idea. And then, how big is this thing that I have in mind? Is it just a small thing, just a feature? And I will touch about it later when I talk about different financing schemes. Venture capital people usually like to finance big stories. It needs to be huge because of the mechanics of how the venture capital fund works. But it's not the only financing option. You have incubators, you have angels, and we'll talk about it later. Sometimes having a feature is good enough. Sometimes using your own money, you can build a small company that will grow, what's called bootstrapping. You bring yourself with the straps of your boots from the ground, and you don't necessarily have to have this huge story, but in some cases the feature turns into a product, and in some cases the product turns into a company, which is really an entity with several product lines, something bigger. So again, it doesn't have to be any of those, but you have to be aware of all the options. On the road to success, you will encounter many fallacies or cliches. People are living the dream and they don't look at the details, and this is wrong. People say, I don't want to tell you about it, it's still just the beginning, and then they miss out on the feedback that would help them so much. People won't dwell on the past. We have the bright future in front of us, and they don't learn from the past, which is another fallacy, because you can learn a lot from the mistakes of others. People think that they have all the knowledge in their brain and no one else knows as much as they do, and of course another fallacy here, because you consult with people and you can learn a lot from other people's experience. You search under the streetlight, meaning that you try to solve a well-known problem, and in many cases it doesn't help much. If you find those people who think out of the box and think of something that has never been there before, there are some chances of doing something great with that. And of course we got the technology, but we never thought that if it has any commercial use, and then, it's very nice, basic research is fantastic, but making something commercial out of it is a different story altogether. Paranoia is not the answer. One of the most important fallacies is I'll keep it close to myself and not tell anyone about it. And this has been known to be really not working. People think that they need to kind of work in the dark, and if they tell other people about it, someone will steal their idea. And time after another, you see that this is not working. You should talk to potential clients, because otherwise you might go to market with an idea that no one will want. You should try to talk to subject matter experts, because you can learn a lot from other people who worked in that area, and if it is a new molecule or a new material or a piece of software or a great internet product, if you talk to people who are already in this area, the chance that they will steal your idea are very small, and this is what we see from many people's experience. The chances that they will add to you by brainstorming with you are very high. Talk to other entrepreneurs, because they went through this before and they know. I've heard this saying that being an entrepreneur is like riding a roller coaster. You can have the highest highs and the lowest lows of your life, sometimes in the same day. Hey, I got funded by this venture capitalist. Oh my God, I just drew my term sheet. So, if you talk to other entrepreneurs and see how they dealt with it, once again, you can learn a lot from that. And talk to prospect investors. And I will talk about different financing schemes later, but investors see a lot of business plans. They know what's going on in the market. And again, you can save yourself a lot of time by talking to them. So the main thing coming from that is paranoia is not the answer. Don't be paranoid. You don't stand to lose anything. On the other hand, you stand to learn a lot from talking to others. No one will steal your idea. People will give you a lot by talking to them. A few little words. There's a huge subject here of how big is the business opportunity, which ties into what I said earlier about features and products and companies. And there are ways of sizing the market sizing exercises. Investors always say that the top-down market sizing exercise is not working. You can say, I'm going to sell cornflakes in China. I will take $1 for every box times a billion people. Then it's a huge billion-dollar market. It doesn't work like that, mainly because it's of sensitivity analysis. We just change a little bit the numbers, and it's not working any longer. So the right way to size the market is a bottom-up exercise. I'm selling a software to hospitals. How many hospitals are there in the UK, and how many hospitals are there in Europe? And let's divide them into smaller ones, mid-sized ones, and larger ones. And then let's see how much money I can take from each group and multiply it, and amass all this information to create a market sizing exercise. You can talk to analysts. You have Gartner and Ovum and many others. It can be a little bit expensive talking to them, but sometimes it can really help you when trying to understand if your market is big or not. And then getting an investment. And again, I will talk about it in the next slide. Not anyone needs an investment. Not anyone should go to a venture capital fund or an incubator or an angel. But if you go to speak to them, make sure that you do it correctly. Many people write a business plan. It's very long. It's very cumbersome. The investor sees a lot of those. He doesn't really have the time or the energy to deal with it. So my recommendation, don't write a huge business plan. Make a 12-slide presentation. This is basically how a presentation should look like. You can find this information on the net. And again, I won't go through all the details because it's boring, but if you work hard on a short presentation and you devote all the time to that, then you will kick ass when talking to the investor, and the chances of getting funded are higher. Mark Twain said, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. It takes a lot of time and effort to really shorten the presentation into the essence of it, but it's worth it. Because then, when you talk to the investor, you want to reach what's called the punch in the gut effect. You want them to say, oh my God, this is interesting. I want to meet those people for another session. And you can only do that with a clear, concise, crisp presentation. There's an executive summary which you can write based on the presentation. There's what's called the elevator pitch. If you only have 30 seconds, riding an elevator from the bottom floor to the top floor, and beside you stands Bill Gates, and you want to pitch him your idea, can you really squeeze it into 30 seconds? If you can do that, and it takes a lot of work, then again, you stand a better chance of getting an investment. What are the financing alternatives? And again, I can talk about it for hours, and I don't want to take too much time, so I'll just touch very briefly. But I think the main message of this slide is that there are many financing alternatives, not just venture capital. First of all, 3 Fs: friends, family, and fools. You go to people at the beginning and you tell them, just give me 10,000 euros, I'll give you 10% of my startup. It's huge, it's going to be the next Google. And sometimes, people start like that. Sometimes the money gets lost. I think that the investors should understand that they're dealing with high-risk, high-return assets here. It's not a T-bond, a treasury bond. It's really the other way around. But this is one way of financing, at least in the beginning. In the past years, we've seen all kinds of incubators and accelerators, spread out throughout the world. And in many cases, they give you maybe 100,000 euros for 10% of your company, and maybe it's not enough, it's just the beginning, just sort of feasibility study. But on the other hand, they have connections. Sometimes you work with other companies, in the same set of rooms, and you learn from them. So it's another way of financing. Angels and super angels and angel clubs. Angels are just rich people who, many of them got rich, selling their own startup. Maybe it's a healthcare product, maybe it's a piece of software or a piece of hardware, and now they want to go back to the community, give a little bit of money. Of course, it's not a charity. They get a piece of your startup for that, but these are interesting people to talk to because they bring you the money, but they also bring you their experience and their connections. And then, of course, the venture capital funds, which, as I said before, they're looking for the big story. They want you to be the next Google or the next Apple or whatever. So not in all cases are they relevant for you. You have micro funds, which are smaller entities, and sometimes they're okay with giving you a smaller amount and then maybe getting a smaller return for that. But it's important to understand that they're just another financing alternatives. Strategic investors, you can go to Microsoft, you can talk to Google. Sometimes they will be interested, and we put a little bit of money because they see the strategic value. Debt financing is different from equity financing, so it's money that does not take a piece of your company, but it's a loan. You can get it from a bank. It depends on the stage in which the company is. I used to work for a bank called SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, who does this kind of thing. They have a branch in Israel, in the UK, of course, originally from California. Government programs, I guess I don't need to tell you about those, all kinds of grants from the framework program, from national programs, from bilateral programs, can help a lot companies or ideas that try to turn into companies. Crowdsourcing is relatively new. You have sites where you can go and say, I have an idea. Everyone who gives me $1,000 will get a nice T-shirt with the logo, and people do that. And so, something that came into existence relatively recently, but is also interesting to consider. And bootstrapping, just starting, trying to, maybe write a piece of software, sell it, use the money to improve the piece of software, and here's another option of advancing and commercializing your idea. The public markets are probably less relevant for companies at that stage, so I wouldn't dwell on that. I have a couple of slides on what you do when you're there, when you have the idea and you've assembled a team and you have a little bit of financing and now you want to start your company. And again, it's not always the right solution for everyone. Some people would prefer to do commercialization in a different way. I wouldn't dwell on it too much. Every bullet here, we can talk about it for half an hour. But first, you need to incorporate your company, and you need to talk to the right people, lawyers, accountants, people who have done this before. Not just because your nephew is a lawyer who deals with, I don't know, insurance, that you would know how to incorporate the company in the right way. How to contact investors. We talked a little bit about this. Usually try to find someone who would connect you to them. Don't cold call an investor. Don't cold call Index Ventures and say, hey, I have an idea for you. Try to find, maybe through LinkedIn, maybe through just talking to your friends, someone who knows someone there. It will make your life easier. When talking to the investor and getting some money in exchange for a piece of your company, you have to go through some legal procedures. There's a term sheet that needs to be signed. You go through a contract. They pass you through a due diligence procedure. All these are important to understand if you really intend on doing this. And I wouldn't go into the details, but first of all, I'm free for questions afterwards, and tomorrow I'll be here as well. And there's tons of material about it. I think the main thing is to be aware that you need to know about those things before sort of running into the wild with your idea. Your partners. So your team will never be one person. It's never going to work like that. And your partners are people that you need to learn to live with. Moreover, your investors are people that you need to learn to live with. It's a bit like marriage, I guess. It's easy to bring them in. It's harder to to break things apart. So just be aware of all that when going there. And then, of course, the board of directors. When you give investors a piece of your company, then they have the right to sit on your board of directors, and you need to tell them, let's say, monthly what's going on. And sometimes you have different directors with different agendas, and you need to understand how to deal with them. So again, it's not easy, but it's important. I think the message here is to know about all those things before you start. I'm not, God forbid, trying to discourage anyone. That's really not at all the idea. On the contrary, but it's important not to go there, all starry-eyed, but instead understand exactly what are the pitfalls, what you're going to encounter on your way. A few words about after you start your company, how is it going to advance? So in many cases, when you raise money, you have sort of a seed round. You raise, €500,000, €1 million, and then you manage to grow the company, and suddenly you want to raise more money, maybe 2, 3, 5 million euros, because you start having your product and selling it, and you want to expand and maybe open a branch in the States and start dealing with strategic investors on the West Coast. So you need to talk to investors and show them that you're growing the value of the company from round to round. You're building more around your product. You're selling it. You're signing strategic partnerships. It's an important element. Watch out for your customers and for your product. Don't just sit on the laurel wreaths, but check all the time you go with your customers if they're still interested. You wrote this piece of anti-fraud software. Maybe the regulation has changed and the banks don't need it anymore. What a bad surprise it would be when you come out in the market with it. So, follow your customers, follow their needs, and follow your product. And even when there's no need, when you launch, instant messaging for the first time, and you're happy to discover that people are using it, be on top of things all the time. Add little things that would make you different from your competition, little emoticons, three-way calls, three-way messages. Just don't sleep. Fighting in the trenches. Life is not easy when you have your own company. The team that manages the company has to deal with many things in parallel. They have their employees to take care of, and sometimes it's like a kindergarten. They have their investors to talk to and give them reports all the time. They have their markets to worry about, and the competition, which of course is another important force. So yes, a lot of fighting. People are talking about pivots, and I refer to what I said earlier about this A team that had a great idea or not so great idea, but in any case, the market has changed. And suddenly you had a great product for feature phones, and suddenly smartphones are there and no one uses feature phones anymore. What do you do with the technology? You need to go through a pivot or through repurposing, and you have to be smart enough. Some people today say that a company is not a real company unless it went through a pivot. I'm not sure. I mean, it's not a goal unto itself, but you just have to be ready to go through changes. And then if everything works well and you're lucky, you get to an exit. You sell your company, like Waze was sold to Google for more than $1 billion recently, or you IPO it on the public markets on Nasdaq. At the end of the day, only one in probably 20 or 30 companies gets there. But when talking to these entrepreneurs, it's worth it. My last slide is the message that I want to leave you with. Sometimes people have great ideas, but they wouldn't move. The idea remains in their head. And then maybe a year later, they see that someone took this idea and made something out of it. So I think the main message is, in this whole area of commercializing ideas, if you have a good idea, do something with it. Don't just sit there. If it's not you, the entrepreneur, find someone else who has business experience, who is more motivated. But if the idea just sit there, it will lose, it will decay with time, and at the end of the day, it is just a pity. So I would urge anyone with an idea to come out and try to see what can be done to commercialize it. And from my experience, from what I've seen from other people, it's worth it. That's it.